Welcome to Build a Business Worth Buying, the podcast where seasoned entrepreneurs, M&A experts, and world-class operators share behind-the-scenes stories of building, scaling, and selling remarkable businesses. I'm your host, Aaron Allpeter, and every week I sit down with people shaping the world of acquisitions, founders who've cashed out, buyers with bold strategies, and advisors who help make deals happen. This is not a podcast for beginners. It's for those who know the grind and want actionable insights to make their next big move. Get ready to take notes, rethink your strategy, and hear untold stories of what it takes to build a business worth buying. Hey guys, welcome back. I've got my good friend Chris Wall from Zeus Logics on. So I guess I want to get started by kind of my takeaway from the election is that I think it's not going to be as bad as people think. It's probably not going to be as good as people think as well. Just, given all of my experience with government and things that happen, it's probably going to be somewhere in the middle. But President Trump does have a very strong perspective on how he wants to reshape economics and trade policy and things like that. And I kind of want to start by looking backwards and understanding, we had 4 years of a Trump term and there were a lot of things that were done. Some things stuck, some things didn't stick. And so I'd love to get your perspective first on what did the first Trump term do in terms of lasting impacts on international trade?
Globalization was a huge trend from the early 90s until about 2017. And that big trend, the constant flow in one direction, that trend has been disrupted. And we've now have shifted towards a multipolar, fragmented global economy with less confidence in positive sum outcomes. So while this shift might have been inevitable, sort of reflecting the historical cycle between liberalization and control over the global economy, it was Donald Trump who initiated the first major moves in this direction. He's the one who fired the first shots in the trade war. And that has really been, from that, everything has flowed.
Okay. That makes sense. I think, the Biden administration also chose not to roll back many of the tariffs that were put in place in the first Trump administration. I think they even added some tariffs. And so can you just talk to what were some of the things that were rolled back that you might think about what could maybe change in 5 years versus things that you think are going to be here longer term?
The Biden administration was far more open to international cooperation and the U.S. playing a role in an international world order than the Trump administration was. So bringing the allies a little bit closer in was definitely a thing. You did also see some exemptions from anti-dumping and countervailing duties for Chinese solar goods. But the overall tone remained the same. Also, Biden did impose a 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles. So it was a little bit of a softening, but overall more of the same. This is not too surprising. Both political parties have taken the stance that China is unfairly subsidizing its industries and has closed its market to U.S. goods. And given the remedies that a government has at its disposal, it is not surprising that the policies were continued, and I expect will continue for the foreseeable future.
Got it. Has it been just a China focus, or is there anything you can point to in any of the other countries? I'm particularly interested in the the ally piece, and if I'm a long-term U.S. ally, how should I be feeling today?
Almost like you're viewing a rerun is my suspicion. That also depends on what existing trade agreements are in place, what the balance of trade is looking like. If you think about countries, some countries are poised for great economic gain and opportunity. And specifically, Mexico comes to mind. Mexico has still space to expand its labor force. And there's a lot of Chinese foreign direct investment coming into Mexico in anticipation of being able to take Chinese expertise, capital, brands, and the ability to manage factories and manufacturing operations and run manufacturing operations close to the U.S. Under the protection of free trade agreements. Mexico being an ally, if you ask specifically about the allies, I think that they're the ones that have the most to look forward to. Some other countries that have been in conflict or worried about China, notably Australia, probably will also see a change and a shift, whether that will be more internationalization or them being left more to solve problems on their own, we don't yet know.
Do you think that there's just a general shift toward protectionism for all countries, or is it just something that the U.S. is looking to reallocate itself and to maybe not be as open as it once was?
I think we are seeing a general shift towards protectionism globally. And this trend already existed in a lot of economies, as anybody who's tried to import into Japan, into Korea, into China can tell you, these were not markets that were universally open to foreign companies. They often came with constraints and strings attached that made it very, very difficult to import into those countries. So people have been protecting their industries because they don't see the quid pro quo coming, by which there was comparative advantage at work in both countries benefiting from trade. At the same time as there's been, I won't call it deindustrialization, but a move away from certain manufacturing jobs into service jobs, a lot of countries are seeing that their ability to manufacture certain goods is essentially eroded, and that they are dependent on international trade to secure things that they deem essential for their economy. In the US, for example, it is now virtually impossible to make certain kinds of magnetic parts that are essential for making electric motors for automobiles. Those have to come in largely from China. The US has slapped anti-dumping and countervailing duties on those of 200 to 300%, and it's still cheaper to buy them from China with those kinds of duties than it is to buy them in the US, because we just no longer have the manufacturing base and the capacity to build them.
Wow. That's a fascinating. I wasn't aware of that. And so, obviously there's a huge focus on tariffs and those sorts of things. And part of the question is going to be, at what point does the tariff not actually do something, right? If I were to say, hey, we're gonna increase the tax on those magnets by 400% or 500%, at what point do you start to see things shift and work well? Because at some point, if you either don't have the capacity or your product's just so much better, people are willing to pay more for that than they would have in the past.
So if a market is truly liquid and you raise prices in one area, people will ultimately buy them. For example, by imposing tariffs, people will find alternate sources. The issue with manufacturing is that it's complex, it's hard, it's capital intensive. In order to build a factory to manufacture specialized magnets, or to manufacture any kind of specialized item that requires knowledge of process, specialized machine tools, if you're dealing in the U.S., environmental permitting, all kinds of regulations, is just hard and long. You're not going to be able to quickly set up a factory in 6 months to do any kind of complex manufacturing. You can't even order the machine tools in 6 months in most cases in order to do this. So you can slap on the tariffs, and that will eventually generate a reaction. But if the reaction is purely based on tariffs, does that necessarily incent a company to go and start producing something? What happens if the tariffs go away? Are they then no longer going to be competitive? Are they only competitive when there's high tariffs? So it's a bit of a mixed bag, and call it economic dirigisme, where you try and guide the economy, can work, but it can also backfire in spectacular ways.
Or what are some ways that you think it could backfire?
China, for example, decided that they first wanted to learn how to make automotive parts, and they became a global supplier of automotive parts. Then, starting about 10 years ago, they started producing cars for export, and they've since become the world's largest exporter of cars. They promoted this industrial policy, right? Let's get into the automobile business. And the policy worked decently as long as the people in China who needed to buy a car had not yet bought a car, or if there were large subsidies on cars where people were essentially buying cars below the cost of production. Now that China has had this, their demand for cars immediately met, and the subsidies are being withdrawn, they found that they have massive overcapacity that the state has largely paid for, and they're trying to export their way out of this into other economies. The problem is that, look at what's happened in the EU recently. The EU decided, without having any of the industry participants file a complaint, to open an investigation into China's anti-competitive practices. And the EU commissioner has come in and said, we're going to investigate this because we don't allow this at home, and we aren't going to tolerate it from abroad. So while they may have decided to create an industrial policy to foster production of cars, in the end, they've deployed more capital than can reasonably be used in the global car market. It's likely to make prices come falling down. It's going to have unintended consequences with trade partners, be it the US, the EU. A lot of places are already going to react to this and say, we won't share technology with you anymore. And we certainly, people are slapping 100% tariffs on cars, even at the manufacturing prices they have. It's going to bring the cost back up. So you ultimately have a lot of wasted capital, a lot of wasted energy that could have been spent on other things going into that. It's a bit of a tricky backfiring.
Yeah. And it sounds like this is something that plays out over decades. This isn't something that's going to happen in any one administration. Kind of moving back to a second Trump administration, what are generally the objectives for tax and customs and all those sorts of things that could be impacting supply chains?
So I think if we look back on Trump's campaign promises and policies in his first term and his campaign promises in the second term, broadly, we can say that it includes two things: reducing taxes and using tariffs to bring manufacturing back to the U.S. The hope being that this will increase U.S. economic activity and ultimately tax revenues and repatriate high-paying jobs. This would take some time to unfold, as you don't build factories and train skilled workers overnight, as we discussed a little bit earlier. So also, while lowering taxes is popular, you need to make up the revenue. So if you're going to lower the taxes, we're going to be looking for other sources of revenue. And increased import duties, which are de facto a tax on consumption, like a federal sales tax or a uniform sales tax almost, come in to raise revenue. So I think we're going to see a reduction in taxes and an increase in alternative sources of revenue, specifically tariffs. As one thing to remember about things like tariffs and consumption taxes, they fall on people who typically have the lowest ability to pay for them. So if you increase the cost of buying goods and services to people in the bottom 20% of the economy by even 10, 15%, for them, this is crippling. If you increase it by 10, 15% for people who call it are broadly in the middle class, it's a very, very significant impact because they consume more things than they tend to save or reinvest just by the nature of the amount of money that they have and your general cost of maintaining living, paying for your mortgage, paying for your kids' school clothes, things like that. All these things would be impacted by increased tariffs. And then there's another piece of legislation that, although it was part of the Biden administration where it was enacted, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, or UFLPA, looks set for an increased enforcement. And this was obviously enacted under Biden in 2021. But if you look back, this was a key point of interest for the first Trump administration. And I believe it was Mike Pompeo even designated the treatment of the Uyghur Muslim population in China as a genocide. So we've already seen budget allocations be increased for this under Biden. And my understanding is that we're going to see increased enforcement and increased budget for this going forward.
Got it. And what were some of the things that they were doing other than I know that you had to go back and kind of trace and understand where your cotton was coming from in most cases, and you had to confirm that it wasn't coming from there. So it was kind of dissuading people from sourcing cotton from China in general. What are some of the parts of this law that you think will ratchet up the pressure a little bit?
So they've been expanding the items as there's been a shift in where people are alleging there is Uyghur population forced labor being used. There's an increase in the number of commodities that are being included. Vinyl floor tile, for example, has been pretty heavily targeted. Solar obviously was a big issue because of the polysilicon. So you're seeing an increase in the commodities being targeted, and you're seeing an increase in the regions from which they come. Also, if you look into forced labor, is not uniquely a Chinese issue.
Right.
It is estimated that there are 7 to 10 million people who are working under forced labor, or sometimes called modern slavery conditions, in the world today. If you look at most of the withhold release orders and interventions on the part of the U.S. government, the majority of them are not coming from China. China is way down there. Last I checked, Malaysia and Vietnam were the number one countries. So you're seeing an expansion of this law because the government is concerned that goods that were produced in the Uyghur Autonomous Region in Xinjiang are being then shipped to other neighboring countries and being manufactured. So there's been a general enhancement or expansion of the countries about which this is being enforced that wasn't initially anticipated.
Interesting. So the UFLPA could apply to goods coming out of Vietnam or Malaysia. That's what you're saying.
Yeah.
That's
And
interesting.
even in theory, even goods that are being produced in Mexico, is that there's so much transshipment going on of goods that it's very, very hard to determine where things actually come from. So this traceability requirement is going to expand to other countries, and it's just sort of becoming a bit of a best practice for especially larger, more organized players, but probably increasingly for smaller companies.
Gotcha. So in other words, this law is forcing people to take a look at their supply chain, and it almost feels like it could be a backdoor to getting people to get out of China, even on like a tier 2 or tier 3 level, because if I understand it correctly, the aim or the initial intent of it was to protect a minority population in China, and therefore kind of also be a bit divisive with China. And so if we're saying that we're now going to be looking at goods coming from Mexico or Vietnam being subject to this level of transparency, then it effectively just becomes a bigger battle line to say, hey, don't have anything coming from China, even if it's your supplier's supplier. Do I have that right?
I think you've sort of nailed it. This is a place where trade policy is dovetailing perfectly with human rights policy, and you can expect to see more enforcement. And it's not only UFLPA that's pushing for this visibility and understanding of supply chains. There's separate legislation in California. In the EU, you've got legislation in Germany, legislation in France, you got legislation in Canada. Ex-US, the legislation has considerably less teeth than it does in the US, but you're seeing similar pushes in lots of places. The EU decided to take a stance on traceability, which is much softer. They often let the US lead some of the more aggressive positions in the world. Sort of historically, it's been a thing. But yeah, you're seeing the same trends globally with the same concerns about human rights, but also about supply chain integrity and about also protecting your own industries. As
Yeah.
the easiest way to make sure that you do not have Xinjiang cotton in your garments in the U.S. is to buy American cotton. But unfortunately, all the American cotton is sold out. You can't easily procure cotton or manufacturing capacity for garments in the U.S. right now.
Interesting. Yeah, one of the things that people talked about with global trade or free trade was the idea that if we engage with these countries, that the economic activity that we were having would spur an adoption of human rights or values. We were gonna work with them, but we were gonna give them all these strings attached. And it seems that over the last 25 years, that experiment has to some extent failed, either in the sense that people have not changed the way that we thought they were going to be, or we've decided that like, hey, we really like the stuff being a lot cheaper than it could be. And so I guess the question I have for you is, as we see this trend toward protectionism, to what extent is the U.S. or the West in general going to be able to exert its values and try to be able to say, hey, this is how we want you to act when we work with you, if we're kind of closing off a little bit? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good question, and it plays into protectionism and isolationism in general. My read on the world is that we are moving increasingly away from a globalized system in which there's a view of positive sum relationships between nations and all nations normalizing on certain values. And you could broadly call these the values of classical liberalism, right? Individual rights, protection of contracts and property, due process, rule of law rather than by law. All these ideas have taken a bit of a hit in the past decade, and I think that we're going to continue to see that occur. I don't think that our policies are going to have much of an impact on which sovereign nations run their process unless unless they have a very, very strong incentive to be long-term integrated with the post-World War II US-led world order. If you were China, you now have a big enough economy, and if the US decides not to trade with you anymore, you'll trade with South America, you'll trade with Africa, you'll trade with much of Asia, you'll trade with India, or you'll trade with the newest client state, Russia. There's too many options, and while there may have been the possibility to influence things 25 years ago, at this point in time, if you go to Chile or Argentina, like I did this past August, the majority of new vehicles being sold are coming in from China. They have a market for their goods. There's a willingness to take them on without imposing conditions. And China is usually not only the low cost seller, but they've also gotten to be so good at producing things that are no longer produced elsewhere in the world. Unless you're willing to deal with inferior goods, it's very, very hard to get around dealing with China in a lot of areas. So I don't see the goals of people in the European Union or North America really impacting the way people behave in other countries at this point.
That's a great take. So much of what people have talked about and what we've talked about is the impact of tariffs on the global economy that we could expect from a second Trump administration. But there's so much more beyond that. And so I'm wondering if the administration were to get really aggressive and they were to look at changing some structural things beyond tariffs, what sorts of things come to mind that they could change? So I'm thinking like de minimis seems like it's something that could be ripe for being scrapped, potentially uniform sales tax for e-commerce, repeal of renegotiation of free trade agreements. I mean, what sticks out to you as we all know that tariffs are going to happen, but what are those next big things they could go after?
Well, let's start by one thing that's probably not specific to the Trump administration and would probably have happened in any administration. And it was my read, and that is the erosion, if not the elimination, of the de minimis exemption. So this is the exemption by which goods entering the U.S. underneath $800 per person per day are not subject to duties. It used to be that collecting $5 or $6 of duties was just cost prohibitive, right? You were going to have people mail you checks, add them in at origin. It was just going to be very, very hard to collect, and getting people to process the documentation necessary to assess that was just really, really difficult. These days, with most commerce being electronic, in particular e-commerce, you have a commercial invoice and an assessment of what's coming in. You got payment records of what's been paid by the consumer in the US. You've got the ability to track what the value of goods is in a relatively automated way. My suspicion, we're going to see an end, or at least a massive lowering of the de minimis threshold. If you just think about the amount of money it's going to bring in, I think last year we came up to, was it 1.2 billion parcels coming into the US?
It was
the majority
a lot
of it coming in from China.
Yep.
Was that the number?
That sounds right. Right.
Imagine slapping on average $5 in duties on 1.2 billion. You come up with $6 billion. That's starting to be a meaningful amount of money. If you then also look at the proposals to put on a $2 per package security assessment fee, that can sort of bootstrap your enforcement budget, your technology buys. So I think we're going to see an erosion of that. And we wouldn't be the first country to do it. The EU got rid of all that in 2021. And these days, if you import a $10 package into the EU, you're going to have to pay a duty bill, which is going to be actually quite steep, because you've got to cover FedEx's or DHL's cost of administering that. So you may be paying $8 on a $10 package. But they've managed to do it. They figure out how to do it, and DHL will send you the invoice, and you'll pay the invoice, and it's been done. Canada lowered their de minimis value a while back. I believe it's right now at $40 Canadian if you're coming from the US or Mexico, and $20 for the rest of the world. So this is something that's been done. It's been a while coming. People have proven it can be done, and I don't think that the administration will particularly look kindly to people avoiding tariff laws by using de minimis.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I completely agree with you. And if we think about bringing jobs back to the U.S., there's a lot of investment that's happened in warehouses on either side of the border just to do basic fulfillment, right, for 321. And so, there could be thousands of jobs there that would be moving elsewhere that, would be there. So I could definitely see that being something in their toolkit. Anything else come to mind?
So you mentioned free trade agreements and most favored nation. I think that we're going to see a lot of those renegotiated and that they may be expanded. Free trade agreements are a tool of foreign policy. It's a way to reward the people you like doing business with and alternatively punish the people you don't like doing business with. So my suspicion is that we're going to see expansion and of free trade agreements within the US's backyard. So into Latin America, expansion possibly of CAFTA. That's something I'm expecting to see, and it's going to be interesting. It's in the US's interest to bring into the fold and have tighter trade relations with people who are essentially in the backyard, if you will.
I guess that makes sense, because if you're lowering trade barriers across the board, free trade agreements don't mean as much. But if you're increasing barriers, even not just tariffs, but quotas and other things like that, then it is something where these free trade agreements actually mean something, and there's a real value, and you're probably going to be able to steer even more commerce to those countries. So I think that's a smart take. And I think that, my take from this conversation, as I've been thinking over things the last couple of days, is that, there was this broader trend that was happening toward regionalization, decoupling, reglobalization, whatever you want to call it. And basically, the second Trump administration is going to be an accelerant toward that trend. And so it used to be that anytime you were going to produce something, if you had an idea for a product, the default answer that you put very little thought into was China, right? I'm just going to go there. I'm going to find somebody on Alibaba, and there we go. And now what I think is going to happen, and what every company should be doing, is taking a first principles approach to procurement and thinking about this and saying, what do I really value, right? Who could produce this? How could cost change? What's the distance to my customer? Which I think is a bigger thing. Like holding less inventory and being reactive to your customer is probably a bigger thing for an argument in favor of Mexico than even the tariffs, in my opinion. But I see this as something where every company should go through and just reassess, white canvas. If I were to start this business over today, where would my distribution points be? Where would my factories be? And how would I put things together now?
I think you're dead on. It's time for a strategic reevaluation of your procurement, of your supply chain, and you sort of don't really have a choice now.
No, it's an opportunity for procurement professionals to prove what they're worth, right? Mm-hmm. One of my favorite quotes is a Swedish proverb that says, every ship has a good captain in calm weather. And we're now entering, some rough seas from a procurement perspective. And the fact that the Biden administration did not roll back this trend, that they kept the tariffs or increased the tariffs, suggests to me that this is not going to go away in 4 years. This is now the course for the next 20 years. And so it's something where we've got to go back to basics and think about what are those right partners, what are those right areas and circumstances that get there. And, government policy will shift and you'll adapt to that. But I think even if there wasn't these massive tariffs that are coming through, it's time for companies to start thinking about things from a first principle approach and starting over.
Yeah. Good. Which is probably a good exercise in general, right? There's just the pace of technological change that we've seen in the US in terms of information technology may lead to new abilities within industry to go in and undertake exercises that before you might have done once every 4, 5, 6 years, you could now do more quickly. And I'm, of course, talking about the use of AI just to do modeling. The exercise that before took 40 hours of work now takes 6. So yeah. Why not do things more iteratively, more quickly, and try and be a little bit more nimble?
Yeah, completely. Lots of stuff changing, so it's a good chance to reset. So I want to get your take on 2 questions we ask everybody on Build a Business Worth Buying. And the first one is, what is the best example of a moat that you've seen a business build?
One of the ones that always has fascinated me a little bit is Google. When Google came on the scene in the early 2000s, they had a different approach to understanding the internet and to mapping it. right? But they essentially they sent a bunch of crawlers and they indexed and they built a massive database of all the websites that existed out there, how they connected through to each other, and what they mentioned. This is a little bit different than what Yahoo was doing, where they essentially had people more or less building a database of what different websites were, which was something that was conceptually fairly easy to do starting in like the early 90s. When you had people literally coming up with just like a list of cool websites, and they'd put that list of cool websites onto a web page, and you'd go and you'd click, and that was like Jerry Yang's idea of what websites were cool today. As they built up a stronger and stronger and stronger, essentially database of all the interconnected websites, it became harder and harder for people to catch up with that historical depth that they had. And I'm fascinated to see a lot of these kinds of network effects, including for things like self-driving automobiles. I don't see how anybody really can catch up with Tesla or with Google in producing more footage of miles being driven. And I'm excluding from this discussion what's happening in China, as they just have such a large market. They have the ability to impose requirements for cameras, and people are just much more tolerant of having their life recorded, whether they want to or not. So you have these companies that just build these massive databases. And if you were to try and come back and say, all right, let me try and acquire 500 million hours of driving activity by going and essentially financing a fleet of cars and paying a bunch of people to drive it around, it would be just financially untenable. So you have these businesses that through their very, very nature develop these massive assets that simply cannot be duplicated for any amount of money. As the other problem that people would find trying to come into this market is that if you want to raise $10 billion to go and build a new corpus of training data for your self-driving car application, Google can go do the same thing. But chances are their cost of capital is going to be lower than anything you can come up with, on top of them already having a built-in advantage.
Yeah. Now, I think it's interesting. What you mentioned was just this different framework on how they went about the internet. And it was really curation versus discovery. And there was that shift early on where people are like, oh, this is cool. Like, tell me what's cool. To here's everything. Literally, what do you want to know? Ask a question. And I think you're right. Like, if you have a theory or a thesis on where the world is going, and you can put that first stake in the ground, there's enormous network effects because it is a winner take most environment. So that's a really interesting one. The second question that we like to ask is, if you had to start today, how would you go about building a business worth buying?
Today, January 2025, I'm going to bet that the boom era of venture capital that we saw in the early 2020s may take a while to come back. So one thing I've been thinking a lot, and that your comment made me think also about this transfer of wealth, is how are you planning into like the next 10 years? As figure you're going to spend 7 to 15 years actually building a business to the point in time at which it would be saleable and attractive to a buyer to come in. So one of my concerns, and I realize this is considered very, very strange, especially by the Silicon Valley set, is this concept of capital efficiency. How little money can I put in to get a maximum amount of revenue out and a maximum amount of value for shareholders? So looking at this, I tend to steer away from things that are focused on mass consumer adoption, as I find a lot of these consumer businesses, if you're going to be selling, the customer acquisition cost scares me a little bit. And in today's market, if you're going to produce something that might be in turn resold via Amazon, the ability to produce goods and to produce something that has a defensible moat is difficult for me to understand. So I tend to like businesses that have institutional complexity behind them and that have moats that are based around specific knowledge of really, really boring things. Right? If it's the kind of thing, if a 10-year-old or a 15-year-old would say, yeah, when I grow up, I totally want to be in that business. That sounds like the coolest, most awesome business there is.
Run.
just like, no. Can we go and find something like, I want to be in the optimization of, usage fees and permit facilities for people dealing with the US government, so something like that.
I almost fell asleep when you said that.
Yeah, that's the whole idea. If it takes somebody, if you have to go and look at a problem and understand a problem that is opaque, not terribly exciting, and very, very pervasive and persistent, chances are that you can build a business while nobody else is looking and build that business and grow it, and that there will be other people that will have that need. Because the needs are often a little bit hidden, right? They're these things that are just baked into corporate processes. Every single company has to go and file whatever that permit is for use of this application, or this EPA assessment fee on that type of facility, whatever it is. But nobody really wants to think about it. So these processes get baked deep into corporations. There's somebody over there, the kind of person you probably don't want to be stuck with on the elevator, who manages that particular process. And finding businesses like that tend to be interesting for me.
Yeah. Yeah, that is a very contrarian view of how people look at it. So I like that. I agree with you. I think that you mentioned a comment about just how businesses are going to be funded in the future. And I agree. I think that we will not see 2019 for a very, very long time, in large part because of where interest rates are. And two, I think that, there was this bubble with SaaS becoming a thing and all of these exits and all of these folks like, what's the next big thing? You took this SaaS venture model and tried to apply it to deodorant and to dog food and to all these other things that aren't really SaaS, right? There's serious cogs behind them. And I actually think this isn't the end of the world, because while there will be fewer companies that are generated, I think that they're going to be better companies. They're going to be stronger. They're going to be more fundamentally sound, and they're going to be much better businesses to buy. I think that the number of times I've talked to a founder and, they're doing $20 million in revenue, but losing $5 million a year. And they're like, oh yeah, we're going to sell one day. And well, what are people buying? Like, oh, the brand. I'm like, your brand doesn't mean anything. It doesn't resonate. It's small. You've got one product. And I think that we got kind of lazy in the startup ecosystem, where we just kind of assumed that there would always be money and there would always be a buyer, and the stuff in between we didn't really have to worry about. And I think it's really an area where you've got to have those sound fundamental principles of, hey, you've got to be profitable. Whether you're $100,000 a year or $100 million, you've got to be profitable, like bar none. Businesses want to buy other businesses that make money, not charity cases. Second thing is you've got to have some sort of unique capability. You've got to have some unique thing that you're doing that is a bit of a moat, right? Like you said, whether it's people, whether it's access to customers, access to technology, or to a source of supply. And then I think the third piece is you've got to think through the acquisition from the acquirer side. And what I usually tell people is you've got to build in a easy layup for that acquirer. And so maybe you don't go international day one, right? And you leave that there. So that's a story that they can tell. And so when they're thinking through and they're saying, all right, yeah, we're going to pay $100 million for this company, but we know that, man, if we just leverage our existing relationships and take them into Europe, this business is going to go from doing, 150 million, 200 million to 500 in 2 years. And so that helps me justify paying a premium and all these sorts of things. And so there's like lots of things there you have to think through, and it's a holistic piece. And so many people just focus on getting a business started and playing startup, and not enough people think about, all right, well, even if I want to run this for 15 years, what's the outcome that I want 15? How do I start building that today so that the optionality is there? Because you never want to have to sell a business, right? You never have to want to go look for money. You want to be in a position where people come to you and they're thrilled with what you've got, and you're able to put your best foot forward kind of without trying.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned people playing startup and doing things like wanting to go international and not thinking in advance about what it is that their business does.
Yeah.
If you're going to see fewer opportunities for financial buyers to come in and essentially be able to go source low-cost capital and use that to buy businesses and optimize them, call it the traditional private equity buyout model, then you really have to think about, from my perspective, the bigger pool of buyers are going to come from strategic acquirers, companies that are in a business that is adjacent to the one that you've done, or can grow their business, Or like you mentioned, can say, all right, Aaron, you've got a company that does really well in the US. Well, we think we can take this and expand it into our existing footprint in South America and Africa. And then thereby we're going to take that business because we know that the kinds of services that you run over at ISBA are desperately needed if the African economy is going to grow and grow into e-commerce in the way we anticipate it's going to do so. And finding these places where you have a small company and an entrepreneur are willing to take on a high degree of risk that the corporate world just won't take on, because the corporate world doesn't do risk. Typically, there's one outcome for risk taking in the corporate world, and that is in the 90% of times in which the venture that you sponsor fails, which is probably a reasonable failure rate for most ventures, even within the structure of a corporate world, you get egg on your face as the sponsor. In the 10% of the time where it succeeds, you get a pat on the back. And the egg on your face may be a demotion, it may be being firing, it may be being ridiculed in your place of work, it may be being permanently sidelined out of the people who are being promoted. So corporates just inherently really don't want to take on risk, and they need people like us to come in and say, I think that there's an opportunity there. And for me, there's enough of a lift in doing this kind of work that I can hopefully take care of my bills and live fairly well. And if I produce something that is then going to fit into a broader corporate portfolio, when it comes time to retire or I just want to move on to a different business, I can pass that off on to a corporate as a validated and proven concept.
Yeah, I mean, so many corporate companies have just, what they've done is they outsource their risk taking to start, and that's their innovation strategy, that's their acquisition strategy, is go out and find folks that are there. Yeah, this has been fantastic. If people want to get connected with you and learn more about Zeus, what's the right way to do that?
CW@ZeusLogics.com.
That's easy.
And we have a website where people can reach out to us too.
Awesome. All right, man. Well, this is great. We'll do this again sometime, and really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's been fun.
Thanks for joining me on Build a Business Worth Buying, brought to you by ISBA Consulting. I hope today's conversation gave you real insights into scaling smarter, selling better, and thinking like a strategic operator. If you found value in this episode, make sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who's building their own sellable business. Until next time, remember, the real win isn't just building a business, it's building one worth buying.